Hello and welcome to Argus Crude Report, a podcast at Argus Media where we look at recent developments that affect crude markets in Europe and beyond. My name is Lina Bulyk. I am a deputy editor of the crude team here in London, and today joining me is Melissa Gurusinghe, our reporter that looks very closely at Russian and Caspian crude markets. Hello, Melissa.
Hi, Lena. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me. There've been some quite big and serious developments around CPC Blend, the largest Kazakh crude stream and one of the most important grades in European slate. And Melissa has been following those very closely. So can we start with you telling us what has been happening with Kazakh crude supply over the last week or two?
hmm So the latest development to rock crude markets, in particular European crude markets, over the past week has been the suspension of exports from the CPC terminal, which is a port on Russia's Black Sea coast. And as Lena mentioned, it ships CPC Blend crude, which is one of Europe's largest imports and streams. And the suspension followed a spate of drone attacks on tankers near the terminal waiting to load cargoes. Around 6 tankers in total were targeted between the 17th and the 23rd of July, and at least 4 of those were hit. But what's interesting to note is that, unlike in previous drone attacks, these tankers that were targeted were mostly supposed to carry Kazakh origin oil, and they were destined for European refiners. We've seen Ukrainian forces target tankers in the region over the past month or so, but it's mostly been tankers carrying Russian origin oil products, usually on sanctioned vessels, that were targeted. But the spate of drone attacks over the past week or so has been the first time effectively that CPC Blend tankers have been targeted so persistently.
Okay, and so the loadings were suspended on 20th of July, right? So over the week after the suspension, how much of CPC Blend exports were, well, never happened? Did it have any impact on Kazakh oil production?
So there was a pretty major impact because we're talking about a stream of around more than 1.5 million barrels a day. So when exports were down for just a matter of days, effectively around 8 million barrels of CPC Blend, which were supposed to load, did not sail, and that meant that crude receipts at the terminal had to stop. The terminal's operator seized that within a matter of I think 1 or 2 days, which was very quick. And as a result, Kazakhstan also had to cut its crude production, which is by around a fifth, or more than 400,000 barrels a day, from its usual levels of around 2 million barrels a day. And that cut in production mostly came from the Tengiz field, the 9 billion barrel Tengiz field, which is Kazakhstan's one of Kazakhstan's largest oil producing fields and the main source of supply into the CPC Blend system.
The loss of 8 million barrels of crude that never loaded and the suspension or the reduction in crude production does sound quite dramatic, but how big it is in European context? Is it really feasible? Like, can European refiners feel any impact?
I think it's important to remember that this outage last week came against the backdrop of incredibly disrupted Mideast Gulf supplies due to the widening US-Iran conflict. So last week, we also had Yemen's Houthis joining the fray effectively and potentially disrupting European supplies shipped from Saudi Arabia via the port of Yanbu. So European refiners were already kind of panicking about their crude supply when this outage happened at the same time. And over the last 4 weeks, we've seen crude prices climbing steadily higher, even before last week's disruptions on account of that rising tension in the Mideast Gulf, because it was quite a reversal from last month when it looked like Europe was struggling with a prompt glut supply, because there was so much US crude floating around. But yeah, it seems like that completely switched over the course of the last few weeks.
Right, so CPC loadings disruption came at a very bad time, and indeed we saw prices for many grades coming up to 2 months highs relative to dated as of late this week. But then CPC loadings resumed this Monday, right? So the grade was offline for a week. It did have some impact on supply, but do you see prices easing back on this positive news yet?
hmm So we've not seen, despite the fact that the exports resumed yesterday, we've not seen European refiners immediately rushing back to the market. And so we've not heard of a specific surge in purchases, jump in purchases of, and I think that reflects the fact that the market remains cautiously optimistic, maybe more cautious about the fact that the situation and security concerns around the CPC terminal still remain on the forefront of minds of a lot of shippers. Um, and Mhm.
Yes, and it kind of makes sense if you think about the current very healthy margins environment. Uh, it must feel very painful for a refiner to lose that cargo that they booked a while ago and that never loaded. So if you look at cracks in Northwest Europe, we see diesel at probably all-time highs. We see gasoline and even naphtha cracks quite wide. So do we know whether refiners somehow managed to find any replacement for those cargoes, or do we think that they had to reduce their runs because they didn't get their supply?
Mhm. So we heard European refiners turn to CPC Blend's rivals like WTI and other light crudes from Northwest Europe like 40s to cover some of that lost prompt supply. And in the Mediterranean, we saw refiners turning to Libyan Aciда, which is another key stream in the region. And so that potentially reflects the fact that the refiners have very little patience for not getting those supplies, because, as you say, margins are so healthy at the moment.
Um, and as you mentioned, CPC Blend is particularly big in the Mediterranean market and less so in Northwest Europe. So do we see Mediterranean refiners extending their buying of light sweets from other regions beyond those prompt cargoes that they needed to cover, or was it limited to these cargoes that they needed to replace so far?
So far, we've not seen Mediterranean refiners continue continue to be as interested in the Mediterranean supply as they were potentially last week, when we saw a slight uptick in demand from that region for grades like Algerian Saharan blend and Libyan Aciда, whose prices did go up slightly when the CPC blend outage happened. But yes, the Mediterranean is particularly exposed to any disruptions to CPC blend because it's basically the base load for the region, and there's no local replacement as big and or as cheap. And so I think with the return of CPC blend, what we could see is that those refiners basically return to CPC blend, and demand for those Libyan and Algerian grades could go down as a result.
Why do you think that Mediterranean refiners would not book WTI or 40s instead of CPC blend if there is still some uncertainty whether loadings of CPC blend will be steady over the coming weeks?
hmm So the main reason that a stream as big as WTI doesn't come into the Mediterranean as much is because of its shipping costs. And so CPC blend compared to WTI shipped into the Mediterranean is around a $5 to $10 per barrel discount. So its CPC blend looks so much cheaper than WTI in the Mediterranean, and the same is true in Northwest Europe as well, but it's a slightly narrower discount, so of around $2 to $6 per barrel. CPC blend is at a discount to WTI in that region. But what does minimize what does make CPC blend much more attractive to refiners in the Mediterranean is that they are much more tolerant of CPC blend's high mercaptans content, which sometimes puts off Northwestern European refiners. But that's not to say that Northwest Europe doesn't like CPC blend, because the buyers that take it regularly in that region can handle mercaptans. But it is a potential issue for some refiners in Northwest Europe that the Mediterranean region just doesn't have. So really, there's little economic sense in Mediterranean refiners taking WTI where they could take CPC blend, which is a much more discounted grade than some of the other grades available.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And the last question I have for you is, it still looks like the biggest issue for Europe is a lack of medium sour supply, as that is the immediate impact on supply that Europe suffers from the US-Iran war. So the region lost nearly 600,000 barrels of Basra crude that are not coming here regularly anymore and are not as reliable as it used to be. CPC blend, on the other hand, is much lighter than those medium sour grades that are not currently available. So how critical it actually is for the region that CPC loadings stay stable and at normal levels?
Yes, well, I mean, as you say, CPC blend is a much lighter crude than what refiners in the region would love to run, I'm sure, medium sour grades that are incredibly high in middle distillate yield. So CPC blend doesn't have as high a middle distillate yield, but it's pretty decent, and yeah, it's pretty decent even though its primary yields are gasoline and naphtha. It still does produce a decent middle distillate yield. But I think the thing that continues to drive CPC blend demand in Europe is it's such a huge stream, and it's such a competitively priced stream, and that's what refiners in the region need, especially when crude markets are so unstable and volatile. The region needs a stable supply of Atlantic basin grades to ensure that they can maintain runs at a decent level. So I think from a refiner's perspective, potentially, with margins as good as they are, it might be better to run a suboptimal slate with a lighter crude rather than cut refinery runs.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. We'll be following very closely any developments around CPC blend and other crudes that a European buyer relies on. And you can find more analysis on these issues and other topics in our daily Argus Crude Report, in our analytical publications such as Argus Global Markets, and of course online on our website, Argus Direct. If you have any questions, comments, or queries, please do get in touch. We would love to hear back from you. And thank you very much, Melissa.
Thanks, Lina.